Over the last 3 weeks, I have been preaching on Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, and so this week I would like to end Advent by bringing it together and offering some practical applications theologically and spiritually. And the first is, and this is probably one of the most helpful things I can offer you, is to understand what is meant by the literal historical sense of these chapters, because these things are in dispute. The Pontifical Biblical Commission, which I quoted a couple of weeks ago, answered dogmatically, definitively, several questions about the authorship and what needs to be believed by Christians regarding the literal historical sense. And just a caveat here, thanks to fundamentalism, this word literal in the church is misunderstood. The word literal historical sense, the way it's used technically, because it's a technical theological term, means what the authors, God and man, intended when they wrote. What was the intention of the author? And so it's not what does each word mean, but what was the intention in what was being written. And so I'm going to share with you the simple list of the things that they said, that the literal historical sense may not be called into doubt in the case of facts narrated in the same chapters which touch on the foundations of the Christian religion. Namely, the creation of all things by God, the special creation of man, the formation of the first woman from the first man, and therefore the unity of the human race, the original felicity of our first parents in the state of justice, integrity, and immortality, the command given by God, the transgression of the divine command at the instigation of the devil under the form of a serpent, and the degradation of our first parents from the primeval state of innocence, and the promise of a future Redeemer. So, those are the things which the church has defined, it's been intended by those scriptures. Therefore, while we may accept any legitimate scientific theory, we are not free to accept the ones that reject these things. But we want to be very clear. When we speak about science, that word has been abused horribly in modern times. We're not talking about social media science, government-pushed science, etc., etc. We're talking about the sciences pure and simple by themselves. A God who is a supreme being, omniscient, omnipotent, and who spoke everything into being, is perfectly capable of doing everything that we just listed. So when an atheist wants to argue with you about this, it's very simple. Don't argue about this list. You can't argue with someone about this list if they don't believe in God. So if someone wants to bring up the creation versus evolution and they don't actually believe, time out. That's not an exorcism cross, but that works too. All right? Just time out and say, let's talk about God first. Because if you don't believe in God, then of course this is ridiculous. So that's the first thing. It's like arguing the Bible with fundamentalists. You can't argue a particular passage until you say, wait a second, we don't even agree on how to read this book the same way. How can we argue this particular passage? So you've got to take things in the right order. So anyway, I won't go on more about that, but again, true science is never going to be contrary to faith, especially since most of the greatest scientists in the history of the world have been Catholics, and many of them priests and nuns. Now, the fall of man, which we just had in Genesis chapter 3, is the cause of everything else that happens in salvation history. And it's not necessary for us to know the exact nature of the first sin. Notice that eating from a fruit is not on that list that I read earlier. Now, because it's not defined, it's not revealed, any opinion that fits the facts is perfectly valid. However, I found one very interesting that I want to share because of how it ties together what we've been talking about the last 3 weeks. When I was in the seminary, the professor for the theology of the body class told us that John Paul II, who wrote the theology of the body, proposes that the original sin was an act of contraception. Again, in light of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, I want to share some reasons why I think that is a perfectly legitimate theory. Number one, there were a lot of sins that Adam and Eve were not or did not commit. We know they didn't commit murder, And we know they didn't embezzle, among many other things. So there's a number of things that did not happen. The description in Genesis of enjoying fruit illicitly certainly would be a good metaphor for contraception. It's also fascinating to note that scripturally, throughout the Bible, the word for knowing is also the word used for marital relations. And so the tree of knowing good, because marital relations are good, with evil, remember, evil means that there's something missing, there's something wrong. So knowing good with evil would also be an apt description for contraception. We also have, in all of this, the image of a garden is that of a woman's womb, which must be respected. Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, in her book, The Privilege of Being a Woman, comments, what is hidden usually refers to something mysterious, something that should be protected from indiscreet looks. The very structure of her body symbolizes a garden that should be carefully guarded, for the keys of this garden belong to God. There's a connection between Eden and its fruits and Eve and fruit. Adam violates both by his sin, because to contracept is to use a woman for one's own satisfaction, and not the way God intended. The first command God gives in Genesis 1:28 is to be fruitful and multiply, and in Genesis 2, don't eat of that tree. What if they're the same command? The virgin Eve rejects fruitfulness in this theory, despite her knowing a man, and the Virgin Mary, who does not know a man in this way, is fruitful despite that. It's conceivable, unintended, that the shame of the sin, which centers on the genitals, remember the covering, is related to the sin. And it would make sense that the devil would attack the marital embrace. It is a commonly held belief among the fathers that the test of the angels before they could enter heaven was that they had to submit to the idea that God himself would become incarnate and take on human nature, and that a woman would be raised higher than all other creatures. So therefore, this attack on man and procreation and the fertility of the woman, etc., would all make sense. So, although there's no definitive teaching on this, I'm not saying you need to believe this, I'm not trying to push an agenda, but I do think in light of the things that we've talked about that are symbolized and taught by Genesis 1 through 3, there is some validity to this. But, regardless of that theory, we all know that at the root of this sin, because it's the root of all sin, is pride. All sin is ultimately the non serviam, the I will not serve of Satan. I will do what I want with God's creation. I will do what I want on the Lord's day. I will act on my sexuality with whomever I want. I will determine what my sex is and how I express it. I will choose whether I will be open to having children or not. I will not guide my family in the ways of the Lord. I will not submit to my husband out of love for God. I will serve myself instead of God. The theme song of hell is, I did it my way. If you're laughing, you're old. If you're not laughing, it's a song reference. So, because Adam was responsible for the human race, being the head of the human race, when he chose enmity with God, then he chose it for all of his body, everyone who is born into the corporate person. As a psychologist once said, we are all victims of the victims of the victims of the victims of Adam and Eve. According to the definition of the Council of Trent, the faith which Catholics are bound to profess says, our first parents became subject to death and to the dominion of the devil. This is one of the reasons why you do not wait to baptize your children. Once they are born, they need to be baptized, because the longer you wait, the longer they are under the dominion of Satan. Now, just want to bring this all together and conclude with a comparison. If it's in the beginning, it's because it's at the end. There is a connection between everything in salvation history. So from the beginning, what we have is these first 3 chapters. And these 3 chapters then are fulfilled by the new Adam and Eve. So Adam is the head of the corporate person of humanity. Christ is the head of his mystical body, the church. Eve listened to the fallen angel and said yes to Satan. Mary listens to the angel Gabriel and says yes to God. Eve induced Adam to sin. Mary induced Christ to perform his first miracle, which began what he calls his hour, and then united herself to his passion. Adam makes the choice against God in the Garden of Eden, where Christ makes the choice for God in a dramatic way. And I say dramatic way because his whole life was a yes to God. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see the dramatic dialogue there in his prayer. Adam fails at the tree of knowing good with evil. Jesus Christ is triumphant on the tree of the cross. Eve becomes the mother of all the, quote, living, but in reality, as we said, the mother of all the spiritually dead. The Blessed Virgin Mary becomes the mother of Christ and therefore of his members, that is, those who are alive in God. On March 25th, we celebrate the incarnation, the annunciation of the angel Gabriel to Mary, and the incarnation of the second person of the Blessed Trinity, which is the turning point in salvation history when God begins to undo in a definitive way what happened in Eden. And on the 25th of December, 9 months later, we visibly see the first fruits, so to speak, of this promise fulfilled in the Christ child in Bethlehem.